Along the lakeland shore of Derwent Water, past ancient temperate rainforest, you'll find grassy wetlands with a view of the Fowls. This scene inspired this gouache painting that I'm going to show you how to make for yourself. Paint along with me and I'll show you how to create grass texture, the illusion of mountains receding on the horizon, of water reflections and a cloudy summer sky. For this painting, I've used gouache paints and some cold pressed watercolour paper. I love gouache as a medium because of its immediacy, fast drying time and layering abilities. Gouache is very similar to watercolour, but the opacity of the paint makes it easy to build layers on the paper. I use the colours titanium white, burnt umber, ivory black, ultramarine blue, permanent green and yellow ochre. I'll talk a bit more about how I mix the colours as I go, so let's get into the process. I start by drawing out the composition. The main focal point in the painting is the mountains, which sit on the horizon line. So I start by dividing the page in half, as I want the mountains to dominate the mid-third of the painting. The shape of the lakeland shore acts as a leading line towards the horizon, drawing the viewer's eye towards the mountains. In the foreground, surrounding the water, I'm going to paint grass, which will be the most textured and detailed area of the painting. For now, I'm really just outlining the main composition shapes to establish the broad structure of the piece before I start to apply colour. To paint the sky, I start by mixing titanium white with a tiny amount of ultramarine blue, a trick that I've learnt with gouache because it has the same ingredients as watercolour. The paint dries fast on the palette and often needs to be re-wetted. So in the well of the palette, where I've squeezed the paint, I've sprayed a little bit of water, not enough to dilute the colour, but enough to keep the paint fresh so that I can continue to easily mix it throughout the session. Because I'm going to go over this base colour with some lighter blue and grey colours to create the impression of a cloudy sky, I'm not too concerned about creating an even sky gradient. But if I wanted to create a smoother appearance, I would have used a larger wash brush and loaded it with more colour. I wait for the sky base colour to dry, then start to paint over it with the cloud tones to block in the basic shapes. The clouds are quite delicate, cirrostratus clouds that are obscuring the light and making parts of the sky appear light grey. So I mix the tiniest amount of ivory black with the titanium white. The great thing about ivory black is that its hue is blue, a low chroma blue, so it appears cool in tone. This means that it works well when used in applications like creating shadows in the clouds or sky because it harmonises with the other blue tones. The base colour of the sky is dried, and I use a dry brush to paint on top of it with a new colour. This is a specific technique that involves loading the brush with the colour, in this case the light grey colour, then removing excess moisture from the brush with a paper towel. The brush, which is loaded with pigment and not as much moisture, then picks up the texture of the cold pressed paper because it doesn't settle into the grain. This technique is great for creating the illusion of texture and detail, which in this case looks like the soft edges of the diffuse ice particles of the clouds suspended and scattered in the air. I use this dry brushing technique to build up the lighter colour and texture in the area of cloud at the top of the painting. Then once it's dry to the touch, I go over it with a layer of slightly darker grey that I've added a little bit more ivory black to. A little goes a long way with darker colours, so I don't need much more black in the mix to make this shade. I want the transitions to be subtle in the clouds, because all the cloud edges are soft or lost, so it's really a case of building subtle tonal transitions here. On top of the darker grey cloud shadows, I'm going to create some highlights, again with the dry brush technique, using titanium white that has been tinted slightly with the sky blue and roughly brushing on smaller organic shapes over the darker sections. This brings the clouds forwards, creating dimension in the sky. The sky is almost but not completely done. I like to tinker with changing colours throughout the painting, but for now I'm going to move on to painting the base colour of the distant mountain. The mountain appears a mid-bluish purple tone rather than saturated green or brown from the rocks and foliage covering it, due to the effect of atmospheric perspective. There is a bit of science as to why it looks bluer in tone, which is because atmospheric perspective makes distant objects look cooler, lighter and less detailed. This happens because blue light, with its short wavelengths, scatters more as it travels through the air. The farther away something is, like a mountain, the more blue light scatters, and that gives it its bluish tint. For the colour of the mountain then, I mix titanium white, ultramarine blue with a bit of ivory black to neutralise the mix. I also added a small dot of burnt umber, which is a warm earth tone, to further neutralise the colour. Ultramarine blue leans towards purple on the colour wheel, so I don't need to add any red tones to create the purple tint. I load the brush with quite a bit of paint and some water to outline the jagged mountain shape. Bear in mind that gouache colours dry a slightly different tone to what they look like wet. They usually dry to look a little lighter and less saturated, so I keep this in mind when I'm mixing. At the base of the mountain, there are some projected rock volumes covered in grass and forest catching the light. This will appear lighter and more green in tone because it is closer to the viewer. For now, I block in these shapes with a more neutral greyish purple tone, carving out the form of the slopes with block colours. To add more depth and dimension to the base of this mountain, I dab on some tree shapes in block colours using a deep purple-grey tone to represent the tree shadows. This section needs more detail, so I need to add more variety in the tones to create highlights, shadows and texture. I'm using the purple tone that I already mixed on my palette for the base colour of the mountain and slowly adding tiny amounts of green and titanium white to achieve a subtle variation of the base colour that appears harmonious and not too separate. I dab this on around the peaks of the hill where it would be catching the light, and I paint some lines with a darker purple base colour to represent rock shapes on the edge of these slopes. I'm working on painting what's furthest from the viewer to what's closest, so the next step is to paint some distant trees. They're not as far away as the mountain. They dip below the horizon line and are in this area of grassy wetland. However, they're still quite far away relatively, so they take on a dark greenish blue tint. I mix this shade with ultramarine, ivory black and some permanent green pigment. I'm using a round brush to dot tree outlines which appear like small round blobs at the base of the mountain. The next step is to paint the grass in the foreground. There's a lot of detail in this section, so I'm going to approach it by painting in layers of colour, painting wet on dry. I want to start with a translucent brownish base colour, so I create a wash by loading my brush with water and colour that I mixed, which is yellow ochre, burnt umber, a tiny bit of permanent green and ivory black. This base colour might shine through in some of the grass texture that I'll paint in consecutive layers, but with gouache paint, you can start with a darkish midtone to represent a shadow and build it from there. Over this base colour, I'm going to create another translucent tone to deepen, darken, alter the colour profile and start to add texture. This muted green acts as a glaze in this way. I've mixed permanent green, burnt umber, a bit of yellow ochre and a bit of ivory black, diluted the colour, then removed some excess moisture from the brush with a paper towel. The result is a translucent colour with a dry brush. The bristles have splayed apart because I removed excess moisture and separated. These clumps of bristles start to emulate grass texture, which I'm going to build up in layers. Around the bank of the water, the grass is greener, so that's where I'm mostly building up this green glaze. Then I'm going to create a translucent shadow wash of ivory black to show where the grasses are casting shadows and the visible mud around the edge of the water. Because there hadn't been much rain in the Lake District, the grass was quite yellow in tone, so I'm starting to create layers of grass strands with a lighter ochre brown tone and the fine tip of a round brush to highlight some clumps of grass in the foreground. To paint the reflection of the sky in the water, I painted the same colour I used for the sky that I had on my palette but darkened it slightly, as reflections usually appear darker in tone. Then I outlined the reflection of the mountain with the purple-blue tone I already mixed, mirroring the curves of the mountain that sit directly above this section of water. Closer to the viewer, the water appears darker because we're seeing the surrounding grass being reflected in the water and the depths of the lake through the ripples. To create the darker colour, I mixed the colour I used for the water that's on my palette with a tiny bit of ivory black. I quickly want to tell you about the drawing course I created. It's an online course designed for beginners that covers the fundamentals of drawing, then progresses to showing you how to create realistic portrait drawings through practical online sessions. Through 55 lessons, I will help you build your skills up from complete beginner to drawing portraits like this, through practicing how to control the pencil, improving line quality and composition, constructing complex forms and proportions from scratch, and perfecting your shading. So if you're a complete beginner and not really sure where to start, this course is an all-in-one program that will take you from the absolute basics to more advanced techniques so that you can have a skill that you can enjoy for a lifetime. I'd absolutely love to have you join me. I put a link in the description so you can check out the details. The piece is starting to come together, but I need to add some more details to give the painting more depth and dimension. So I add some dots of dark green that I've made more neutral and warm in tone with yellow ochre, burnt umber and ivory black to create a tree line at the base of the mountain. Then I use this same colour to deepen the shadows around the edges of the grass embankment. The key to creating harmony in a painting is through using colours you've already mixed on your palette to tie different sections together. In this example, the shadows of the distant trees and grasses in the foreground are made of the same mix. I'm spending quite a bit of time detailing the grass texture, waiting for layers to dry before I add more layers on top. On top of the shadow layer, I add another layer of highlights with a light ochre green tone. Then I refine the water section to add more details and reflections, which should start to make the piece appear more finished. The reflections of the grass appears darker than the grass itself, so I'm keeping this in mind and mixing the grass colour on my palette with a little bit of ivory black, which also cools down the tone. Whenever I mix a colour, I always mix a little bit more than I think I need, as I'll more than likely use it for another part of the painting. For the reflection, because we're painting water, I'm adding more water to the brush so that the colour spreads and lightens, emulating the properties of water I'm trying to represent in the painting. Before I paint this final piece of grass at the front of the painting, I'm going to deepen the shadows of the ripples in the water beneath the grass by adding a bit more ivory black to the water mix. I want these shadows to appear translucent in layers, so I'm adding sufficient water to the wash to make the paint flow better and reduce opacity. On top of this, I add some highlight details to the ripples to create a sense of three-dimensionality. I add titanium white to the light blue water mix on my palette, and I use the round brush to layer organic shape lines on top. I'm using the same colours and techniques that I used to create the original grassy section for this strip of grass at the front, layering umber and ivory black textures beneath for shadows, then ochre and green highlights on top with the round brush. The last step of the painting is to look at the scene as a whole and decide whether it ties together in terms of colour and tone. You can always go and alter certain sections by glazing small amounts of colour as the final step. I added a few more purpley shadow sections to the mountains and some titanium white highlights in the clouds. At first glance, the painting looks detailed, which can make it seem unapproachable to create. But when you strip the process back, it's all about layering with texture at the base, then building up small areas of fine detail to bring focus to the scene. It's about creating the impression of detail. From a distance and as a whole, the scene appears somewhat realistic, but when you zoom in, you can see a muddle of brush strokes and paper texture. There you have it, how to paint a mountain lake scene with gouache. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribed. See you in the next video.